Welcome to today's session. My name is David Knights. I am a principal consultant for PECT, and we're working on behalf of Business Lincolnshire to deliver the low carbon Lincolnshire programme. Within PECT, we're working to protect and enhance the environment and leave a legacy for future generations. And the reason I'm sort of here today is, the team and I have a good understanding in current trends and challenges in the field of sustainability and really today low carbon, as well as practical ways to implement them. Just sort of go through what this is. So Low Carbon Lincolnshire, we're a program that's been set up by Business Lincolnshire to help small to medium enterprises, businesses in Lincolnshire and Rutland with their journey to net zero. Net zero is a term that we often speak about now, but it can be fairly complex and complicated for organizations, particularly, trying to find out what to do, where to start, what kind of information do I need to include. So what we've done, we put together a series of webinars and workshops. This is an introductory webinar today, so we're just going to cover the basis of what is net zero. But what we're really looking to do is to deliver half-day workshops, and that we want to focus on really sort of working with businesses to go into the detail about how to actually apply net zero to your organization. What we've done is we've split net zero down into 4 core topics. So today's session is net zero, and what we're looking to do is to cover the overarching need for all of this and what we're going to, what's required in terms of delivering net zero, in terms of strategy, things to consider, what to include, how to plan, etc. The second session is then looking at decarbonisation, and in that we're going to explore the carbon element of net zero. So what is a carbon footprint, how to calculate it, and then how to start to add decarbonisation projects to your plan in order to achieve net zero. This will also be supported by virtual workshops. 2 of them keenly will be energy management. Energy management is a workshop aimed to support the decarbonisation one. And here we're looking specifically to help organizations think about what energy management looks like, how to implement a system, how to start to look at and push through energy efficiencies throughout the organization. And then the last workshop we'll be doing is around supply chains, which is arguably the most complex part of net zero. And in that, we're going to explore the value chain and the requirements that sit within the value chain. Now, these last 2 are sort of aimed at organizations that are looking for supplementary or supportive information. The supply chain workshop is really aimed at organizations who are at the point of addressing that within their wider net zero program. So that's what we're going to be covering over the entire series. Today's session is just an introductory workshop to cover sort of net zero. And what I always say, it is just an hour session, so I'm not going to be able to go into the detail. That's really what the workshop's for. So if you are here and are really interested in more detail around net zero, then please sign up for our workshops. And there's also a survey that we have, so please have a look at the survey, as that will help to inform us what kind of content you would like us to include in any future workshops, so we can try and make this a bit more bespoke for you as an organization as well. So that's it from me. I think everyone who's joined is going to. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to start with the presentation. Okay, so obviously, the reason we're here today is to talk about net zero and essentially the net zero agenda. So just to go through the basics of it. So the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, which was COP21, ratified by 196 countries, was that the globe needs to do everything that we can to limit warming to well below 2 degrees. So really recognize the impacts that climate change is having. And the way to sort of mitigate that is to keep the global temperatures to within a sort of a limit. Now, I guess the top point of that is well below 2 degrees, but obviously looking to aim towards a 1.5 degree warming. This will still have impacts in the wider climate, but by limiting that, we're hoping to sort of minimize the sort of the extremes of what that impact will have. Now, off the back of that, the UK has put in law. They want to achieve net zero by 2050. So that's really what's driven the conversation that we hear today. So this was set, I think, in 2019 by Boris Johnson, put in law by the Climate Change Act of 2008, and is really the reason why industry and everyone is sort of talking about net zero and why there's lots of regulatory requirements that sit around that, which will eventually, drive net zero for organizations to achieve it by 2050. So in terms of summarizing the official definition of net zero, when we talk about it, what we're actually thinking about is the carbon emissions within an organization's value chain. And that's the key change from anything that's ever come before. It's not just about you as an organization and an individual. It's actually about the full impact you have across your entire value chain. So anything you do as a business or service, what climate impacts or cause as a result of doing that. Now, in order to, and essentially what we're looking to do is any of those activities must result in no net impact on the climate. And we'll talk a bit what we mean by net in a second. In order to achieve this, organizations must reduce their emissions to as low as they can get it, and then balance any remaining residual emissions through carbon removals. And again, this is a key wording with when we talk about net zero, is the fact that we're talking about carbon removals and not just standard offsets. And again, we'll talk a bit more about what that means in today's session. So when we say net, what are we actually talking about? Now, I guess really as things stand, energy is still heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So we think about transport, heating being the sort of the main culprits there. But we also have to appreciate that 40% of the electricity generated at the moment in the UK comes from natural gas as well. So fossil fuels are basically linked to a lot of what we do as organizations, and the energy we consume as individuals and as organizations is solely really heavily tied to that. So what we are aiming to do is to get to absolute zero emissions, where there are no carbon emissions generated from activity. That's the long-term goal, but we don't currently possess the ability to do that yet because of how reliant we are on fossil fuels. So the only possibility that we can aim towards is to be net zero. And by that, what we want to do is to minimize the amount of emissions we are generating and to actually remove those emissions from the atmosphere to get that balance. So we're not adding any additional emissions, and that's how we achieve the net element to it. Now, as I said, fossil fuels are complicated, and not all of them can be removed or decarbonized. But really, what the reason we're having the conversation and everything is today is because whilst we are waiting for that process for technology to improve and for ability for us to free ourselves from fossil fuels, we still have to do something now as organizations. We can't let perfection be the enemy of the good, and organizations should start to see what they can do now, whether or not they're looking to actually commit to a net zero target. There are ways in which you can start to decarbonize, start to improve your energy efficiency, and actually get yourself ready for that time when you're actually able to fully commit to net zero and really drive through a decarbonization plan. Now, in terms of achieving that, there's sort of three things we need to think about. The first one is the priority for everybody is energy reduction. So we need to consider what's realistic now and what will be the opportunity in the future. First and foremost, what we really need to do is reduce the use of fossil fuels. However we can do it, wherever this is possible, this needs to be the priority because fossil fuels will just never be a renewable fuel source, and so we do need to reduce that as much as possible. Second to that then is also looking at electricity. As I said, electricity is also tied into fossil fuels currently, but we do want to make sure that the amount of energy we're using is relevant and it's not wasted in any way that we can. So we're trying to drive through efficiencies. From a business perspective, that helps with costs particularly. So to do that, we can drive that through efficiencies, improving technology, but most importantly, and what we'll sort of cover a little bit in the decarbonization workshop is around behaviors. So really thinking about how staff use energy, how you as an organization use energy, and how you can do the simple actions to sort of minimize and improve that. So we've reduced our energy, and then effectively whatever's left over, we should then look to seek to decarbonize that as much as possible. And the key thing here is decarbonization is not the same as energy reduction. So energy reduction is the first thing because that has business benefits, but it also helps to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. And then we should look to decarbonize what energy we have left. Now, decarbonization can be done in a variety of ways. We've already talked about putting in better technology, but we could look at things like renewables, solar PV, heat pumps, etc. But it could also be things, for organizations that are in, perhaps maybe tied into carbon a bit more. There are opportunities to switch fuel types as well with lower carbon fuels. So you still have to use the energy that you need to, but actually by decarbonizing the fuel itself, you're able to do that with less impact on the climate as well. And that's why I say decarbonization and energy reduction aren't always the same. Energy reduction is the primary, decarbonization then secondary, and together we can then get to the point where we actually decarbonize ourselves by ideally 90%, but that's once we get to the net zero endpoint. And then the final thing is to then achieve the net part of net zero, and that's where we remove our emissions through carbon removals. Now, again, it's very clear in any guidance around net zero that the removal is the last thing that you do. And so as us as organizations, we would only really start to look at removals when we're starting to approach our net zero goal or target. So if you have a commitment to achieve net zero by 2050, then it's not really till the last few years of that you want to start thinking about, okay, well, how do we now actually look at removing our residual emissions? It's not something you do in the first instance. The reduction and the decarbonisation are the priorities, and that's what we should focus on now as organizations. And so whether you're committed to net zero or not, that's really a key focus for organizations, and kind of what net zero is trying to encourage businesses to think about and do going forwards. Now, just there are a range, within the industry, there are a range of different terms that are used, and sometimes these terms can be a little bit confusing. So these are ranked in order, I guess, of ambition. So carbon neutral being the first element to it. Then we want to look at net zero. That's ideally the aim that we want to get to. We also want to think about being climate neutral, where actually that's where anything within the system has no impact on climate whatsoever. But the sort of the end goal really is aiming at absolute or true zero, where actually we can do all our business activity without actually having any impact on the climate whatsoever, and there's no carbon emissions generated. So that's the sort of the end goal that we want to get to. The main focus I just wanted to pick up on the slide are carbon neutral and net zero. They're not the same, and they don't have the same. They are very different elements. However, carbon neutral is a good pathway to achieving net zero as long as it's done in the right sort of way. Now, carbon neutral can be a little bit controversial. There are some sustainability, I guess, experts that look at carbon neutral in sort of a negative light, because it has unfortunately had some negative press in the past where people have kind of used it as a get out clause. So basically, to talk the difference between it, as I said before, when we look at net zero, what we're looking at is the entire value chain. So it's not just you as an organization, it's everything you do as an organization, and actually looking to minimize carbon emissions throughout that entire value chain. Carbon neutral is not. It's a much more singular focus. So it can be on an organization, but you can also apply carbon neutrality to a product or a service. So, it then starts to become a bit lost as to what you actually mean by carbon neutral in that instance. The second thing as well is that, we talked about, removing the carbon emissions through net zero, whereas carbon neutral doesn't require that. You can just purchase offsets, which I'll discuss in the next slide. But you can just purchase offsets, which can allow you to achieve carbon neutral. So for some organizations, you can be carbon neutral tomorrow. If you really wanted to, you can calculate your carbon footprint, you can invest in carbon offsets, and you can then claim to be carbon neutral. Net zero doesn't allow that. Net zero fundamentally requires reductions, addressing throughout the value chain, and then only at the end of the process can you then actually look to buy removals. And that's kind of the difference between the two. However, by actually aiming towards being carbon neutral, you can start to develop the processes, you could get good carbon accounting, and actually start to work at offsets in terms of actually mitigating wider climate impacts that we can have as well. So this is why I just want to sort of cover this term, because another one that gets a little bit confusing, because we do use it a bit interchangeably when we talk about offsets. Now, carbon removals is essentially a type of carbon offset. The other one is what we refer to as carbon avoidance. So whenever we're talking about offsetting, some people will talk about offsets as being essentially the avoidance element, and some people talk about carbon removal separately, or other times they'll talk about it in the same thing. The way I always explain it is offsetting, and you're either avoiding emissions or you're removing emissions depending on what you're investing in. And just to explain that then, so when we talk about a carbon avoidance, what we're effectively saying is that it's an avoidance offset helps to fund projects that reduce carbon emissions. So just as an example, an area gets its energy from a coal power plant. So it gets its energy from a very dirty source. An offset funded program goes in, sets up a solar PV system, battery system, and essentially provides the energy needed and takes out the coal plant. So what we've done is we've taken a very dirty source of energy, and we've essentially removed those emissions to zero, because now we can supply it through solar PV and through battery systems. So what we're actually doing is we're avoiding additional emissions being put into the atmosphere. But you as an organization, you are still adding your own emissions, and all you're doing with the offset is you're basically buying someone else's carbon reduction to offset and balance yours. But emissions are still going into the atmosphere, and that's why it is a slight offset rather than being a full offset. Now, when we talk about carbon removal, what we're doing is we're actually funding projects that capture carbon from the atmosphere and store it. So here we're not contributing any additional emissions into the to the atmosphere, and that's why we say they're now completely balanced, the net zero element to it. So this is one of the reasons why net zero is specifically focused on removals, because it's the only way to achieve true balance. And also, if you can remove more emissions than you generate, we can actually start to reverse the impact of climate change until such point as we actually become an industry that no longer produces any emissions, and we achieve that sort of that good balance. So um, the sort of the key change there is, again, we're not just avoiding something, we're actually removing something, and it has a much better impact in terms of how we're affecting the climate than just simply paying for other people to cut down their emissions so that we can still pollute. And that's where that negative thing comes in. However, as I said, there is still benefit in looking at carbon neutral. So, I'm a firm advocate of it. I do believe that for organizations starting out, it's a good pathway to start with, because it does help you get prepared and ready for what net zero requires. But it must be done in the right way in order to sort of validate and substantiate the pathway you're going on. So, you need to make sure that you've got, good examples of carbon reductions, a good sort of plan in place. You are actually reducing first, then offsetting second. And the second thing as well is, it's I would always say, if you're going to be carbon neutral, apply it to the organization as a whole and don't just apply it to a product or service, because that's when it starts to become a little bit, unclear as to what you actually mean by it. So if you as an organization are driving towards carbon neutrality, I think that has a much better standing than just offsetting a particular product you produce, because then ultimately the company is still, reducing lots of emissions. And again, it just doesn't seem to match up well with what we're trying to achieve with the aims of net zero as well. Okay, so that's a bit about the background. What I just want to cover now is the reasons why we would want to look at it. So one thing I found, obviously working with organizations, is this isn't necessarily the top of their agenda at the moment. So we have two reasons why most organizations start to approach net zero. The first is because they know it's the right thing to do. They appreciate the impact we're having on climate, and so they want to make a difference. They want to be seen to be making a difference. They start in the conversation of net zero. For other organizations, it's because they've been asked to do so by their clients. So they're now getting pressure from their clients to say, we need you to produce carbon plans. We need you to show us what you're doing. We need you to what are your commitments to net zero? And so that's actually putting pressure on them as an organization. But there are reasons, and these are the sort of business cases, the sort of the standard business cases you get. Obviously, there's key ones really are cutting energy and transport costs. So direct reductions in energy and transport will also help to reduce carbon, but also the costs associated with it. So we can improve the amount of energy, reduce the amount of energy we use, we reduce the costs associated to it. By looking at net zero, it can help you to sort of meet environmental regulations, and these could be legislative or compliance requirements, as I said, particularly with that, that they're being asked by your clients now to produce carbon emissions. It can attract new customers and investors. So banks, particularly, there's lots of green finance at the moment that's really looking at organizations that are addressing sustainability, and that actually helps you to become a much more investable organization where you're actually taking this on board. So you can start to attract better investors or more investments as well. There's surveys, lots of surveys out there. One particularly was this a sort of university survey that gets done every year, and the question around students in terms of, would you work with a sustainability organization? Would you choose to work that over a better salary? And categorically, it's come back that actually over 70% of students would choose to work with an organization who operates sustainability over one that doesn't. So again, if you're looking to attract new talent, really looking to attract, a good solid workforce, then something to do as well to actually look at how you are sustainably and start to promote that as well. And then also it provides resilience to any future security. So, we all know the last couple of years with the energy crisis and the sort of the risk we've had around energy security. By looking at net zero, by reducing your reliance on sort of grid energy and that sort of thing, you can help to sort of protect yourself against any sort of future shocks as well. There are also things like tax implications. So, we've seen a lot of sort of changes to government policy, and some of that is potentially going to lead to carbon tax increases. So again, by decarbonizing and minimizing your carbon, you can help to shield yourself from any sort of tax rises or tax changes, which could have negative impacts on your bank balance in the future. I just very quickly wanted to touch on some of the regulatory requirements. So two key things here, and this is where we're seeing a lot of the conversation come from. So the large organizations are required to report under two schemes, the first of which is ESOS, the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme, and the second is called SECA, or Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting. Now, these are mandatory requirements in which they have to report. Now, ESOS is an energy reporting system, SECA is an energy and carbon reporting system. But what's keen in this is because it's requiring organizations to actually demonstrate improvements, they are starting to push that down their supply chain. So this is one of the drivers that's causing large organizations to actually think we have to report to this on an annual basis. We need to start getting our suppliers giving us the information. And that's one of the reasons why they're asking for it. Another one on that, and this is an example of that, is the procurement. Sorry, the procurement policy note 0621. And this is essentially where anybody who's looking to work within the public sector, if the tender is over 5 million, you are required to produce a carbon reduction plan. That carbon reduction plan has to be annually reviewed, and you have to demonstrate your continued performance towards minimizing your carbon emissions. This is a great example of what we'll potentially see a reporting requirement look like for SMEs in the future. Now, the reasons I wanted to talk about this is because there are already conversations about these sort of mandatory reporting schemes being pushed into the SME world. And at the moment, it's mostly large organizations that need to do it, or very specific requirements in a sort of tender application. But we are seeing conversations within the government at the moment that may look as early as 2026 that SMEs or even medium enterprises will need to start to report mandatory as well. So we are seeing that change. And so one of the reasons why to consider net zero is because it helps you to start to basically approach that subject now, so that should that change, you're already in a good stead to be able to report within these mechanisms rather than dealing with that shock at a time as well. And we know that the government can move fairly quickly on these without much warning to organizations. So it's a good idea to start to get that process in now and start to work on it now to minimize any sort of future shocks. So I guess just in terms of summary, I mean, we know climate change is going to cause massive disruptions to goods and services, particularly those who import and export. We're already seeing pressures within supply chains as large organizations, clients effectively are asking businesses to report or feed into their reporting. We're seeing the public and students take more of an interest in net zero, and particularly asking questions around sustainability. And we're also seeing potential regulatory changes on the horizons that organizations are going to need to report within as well. So why net zero? One, because it's the right thing to do. It helps to mitigate, climate changes. It helps to think about your suppliers, things about the impact you're having on the climate. But most importantly, it does help to you as an organization to protect yourself against future shocks, against resilience, against regulatory changes. The other element as well is because there's lots of free events like this, there's free funding, there's support available at the moment now. So now is really a good time to get into net zero while the funding and support is available, to get yourself ahead of the curve and to get yourself into a comfortable position as we move into the future. So one thing I just wanted to link in, the slides will be available and this will be recorded for everybody, but just to talk about the UK Business Climate Hub has a lot of resources that organizations can go through and really does sort of help to break down what net zero is, what sort of things you can do. So here's the sort of breakdown in terms of what you can do to get to net zero, and we'll sort of touch on a few of these points as we go through as well. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with these webinar, is that when you do go into the UK Climate Business Hub and start to look through it, hopefully from today's session, you'll be able to look at that in a bit more and understanding and go, okay, I know what they're asking for within this point and take it forward as well. So just a very good resource for businesses to be aware of. Just the very beginning and the focus of it. So one thing I just wanted to cover is a carbon footprint, just because I appreciate that not all organizations might be fully aware of all the terms that we're using. So essentially, a carbon footprint is the measure of the impact we have on climate, and that's essentially the amount of greenhouse gases that we're emitting into the environment. There are 7 recognized greenhouse gases, which are naturally occurring. But the key point to that is, whilst they are naturally occurring, we are contributing more than the planet can handle with, which is leading to the increased temperature. Now, greenhouse gases have what's referred to as a global warming potential. That's basically how much of a warming impact they have when they're in the atmosphere. And so a way to sort of simplify the process, what we do is that we refer all of the greenhouse gases to carbon. So carbon dioxide has a global warming potential of 1. Methane, which is another global greenhouse gas, has a global warming potential of 25. And nitrous oxide has a global warming potential of 298. So rather than you having to calculate each of individual one of those, we convert all of that to a carbon equivalence, and that's where the term carbon comes from. It's a catch-all that catches all of the greenhouse gases that we need to report on as one single value, and that makes reporting easier. That way, it's a single value. Everybody uses the same value, and it means that we can now compare businesses against each other with a value that actually is equivalent. So whenever we're reporting, we would always report in tons, and you would always see CO2e. So that just means the equivalence part that we're including all of our greenhouse gases when we do our reporting, and that's sort of the basics of it. So when we are reviewing the approaching so looking now at the approach to your net zero plan, obviously, as I said, the net zero plan wants to support the aims of the Paris Climate Agreement. So we're looking to decarbonize ourselves in line with climate science. To do this, we need to focus on actions with interim targets. So what is it we can do now, and what is the opportunity for us in the future? And we really want to look at sort of front loading our carbon reductions. So how can we decarbonize as quickly as possible now, and then just sort of leave the harder to decarbonize ones for the future as we wait for technology to change, etc. And that's really what we want to focus on with all organizations at this stage, is what is it that we're able to do within the next 5 to 10 years? That's the sort of the immediate future that we want to look at, and how can we decarbonize ourselves at this point? As I mentioned, it is a value chain. So net zero looks at not just you as an organization, but also your suppliers and your supply chain. So it's inclusive of all scopes, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. And as I said, the last thing we do is we use the removal offsets only to claim the net zero part of it. So again, these would only be used at the residual and not just at any point as well. So, we want to make sure that we can minimize climate, the impact on climate by hitting that 1.5 degree pathway. We want to focus on immediate action. So what can we do now, and what do we need to do in the future? And look at everything across our organization. So what we're doing as well as our suppliers. And then, as always, that sort of final point to removal at the end of the journey. Now, when we talk about scopes, again, just to go through the process of it, what do we mean? So there are essentially 3 lots of scopes that organizations can calculate their carbon emissions against. So scope 1, this is you. This is everything that you generate as an organization. There's no one else's fault in these emissions than what you are doing. So you are solely responsible for scope 1, and that's why it's a mandatory requirement that you report under it. So this is any fuel that you burn at source, either in equipment or plant that you own or directly control, and the emissions released from that form part of your scope 1. So here we're talking about, boilers. So the gas you burn in your boilers, any fleet vehicles you own. If you have sort of air conditioning and refrigerative plant, the F gases, the refrigerants that go into it, they have significant impacts on global warming. So again, they need to be accounted for as well. The second element is scope 2, and here for most organizations we're talking strictly the purchase of electricity. Now, the reason why it's scope 2 and a sort of an indirect classification is because you don't own the generation plant, you don't own the power plants. However, you are directly responsible and can control the amount of electricity you consume. So whilst it's indirect in terms of how the emissions are produced, it's direct in the sense of you can, to some degree, dictate how much electricity you use. You can look at renewables, you can look at electricity, energy efficiencies, those sort of things. So it is classified as scope 2, but does actually form part of what we refer to as mandatory reporting. So every organization should look at scope 1 and scope 2 in the first instance, because that is ultimately what you are responsible for. So that's any fuels and any electricity that you consume as a company. You need to account for the emissions associated with that, and then obviously look to reduce that through energy efficiency and decarbonize that through maybe switching from fossil fuels to electricity. The final one then, and this is the sort of the complex areas, scope 3. So here's now we're talking value chain. So these are all of the emissions associated with suppliers you work with, products you purchase, where you're not responsible for the emissions themselves, but are indirectly responsible for them being emitted. So for example, waste is a good example. You generate waste, but you get waste companies come in to take that away. So they're basically emitting the carbon by picking up your waste. So you see how you're indirectly associated with that. Now, scope 3 is mainly focused around procurement and staff management. And for many organizations, what we would generally suggest you look at is the easy to go at ones, things that you can start to get the information almost readily available to you. So wastewater, etc. And also thinking about how your staff essentially operate as well. Now, one thing I always say, and we hear this in the industry a lot, is your scope 1 and 2 emissions are someone else's scope 3 emissions, and that's the same. Your scope 3 emissions are someone else's scope 1 and 2 emissions. So actually, one of the key drivers, what we're really looking to do is to get all organizations to calculate their carbon footprints so that everybody essentially can say these are the emissions associated, and actually makes that scope 3 accounting easier when we start to look at it. So just to go through what we're looking for specifically when we look at scope 1, natural gas, any fuels, any petrol, diesel, fleet mileage, as I said, F-gas for refrigerants, etc. And there's some examples of where you can locate that information. And then scope 2 for most organizations will be electricity, which again, you can get from meters and utility bills. When it comes to scope 3, now there are actually 15 categories. We'll talk about this in the supply chain workshop, so I'm not going to touch on it in too much detail. But really what we're looking for is to start with the easy ones. So for most organizations, we'll be starting with waste, water, and then business travel will be the 3 of the easiest ones to sort of look at. The next stage then would be to maybe start to look at procurement. So what kind of goods and services you're buying in, and that would sort of be the next phase to it. But for most of us, we have access to waste data, or we should be hopefully can get access to waste data. We should hopefully be able to get access to our water data, and certainly business travel through expense claims, and maybe within that also commuting as well. Now, for anybody who has to report under the PPN, so if you are in a tender and you're having to do a carbon reduction plan under PPN, just so you know in terms of what's required, upstream logistics, downstream logistics are 2 that are required under PPN. Waste streams is another one, and business travel and commuting is the other one as well. So under the PPN process, you have to report scope 3, and those are the 5 requirements that you need to look at and capture when reporting at a PPN. And again, we'll go through it in more detail in the workshops than we will cover today. So when looking at net zero, obviously we want to have an organizational approach. So really this has to be everybody on board delivering what's essentially net zero. Now you have to, as early as possible, get senior leadership buy-in. Ultimately, they are responsible for informing the strategy and really communicating it net zero as a priority across the organization. Now, obviously, we're all of different sizes. Some have slightly more complex senior leadership teams than others, but really that top-down approach is absolutely fundamental. Management also sits really well within this because management's a kind of link between senior leadership and the workforce, and they really have an active role to play. So really what they're looking to do is that team level engagement, making sure the right people have the right roles and responsibilities in delivering your net zero plan. And then when we talk about workforce accountability, we also want to think about all of the different parts of your organization. So if you have a procurement team, they have a role to play with this: design, logistics, commercial, marketing, operations, estates, facilities, finance, IT. So again, different organizations will have different structures, and this will look very different to each of you in turn. But really what we want to get through in the message here is that actually every department, every business function has a role to play in net zero and should be contributing to both the strategy, but also in the delivery of those aims as well. So again, each function of the organization has a role to play in delivering net zero, and they need to be engaged, but they do need to be engaged and understand their responsibilities. So it can't just be senior leadership says, well, this is what we need to do, but there's no engagement. Everybody needs to be brought along the journey. It starts with the leadership team, is driven by the management team, and is supported by the workforce, the organization itself. Within that, it's very crucial that employee engagement sits within this as well, because they do need to be brought on. When you've done your strategy, you want to use that to empower and motivate employees, those who are particularly interested in the climate crisis and active in that area. So you want to try and encourage participation, really aiming at the proactive, engaged employees. But you also want to make sure if anybody's got the right skill sets, that those skill sets are utilized in the best way. So, for example, if you have got a facilities team, the manager of that is engaged in this conversation because they will help you understanding how better to improve the efficiencies across the site. You are going to look to develop new ways of working, which means really before you start to make changes, you should consult with your team. this is our plan, this is what we're going to do, and this is how you can support us. Let's have a conversation about it in terms of how you feel this would work best. So, by just making changes and forcing it on, we do find that we do get backlash. So the idea is to try to bring as many people as you can along with you. There's always going to be an element that isn't bought into it. I think the stats, if you can get 80% of your business on board, you've done an amazing job. But really, the best way to sort of encourage that is just to make sure that engagement and communication is there. And most importantly, training, skills help to support delivery. So, those who are on the call today or those who are coming to the workshops, good opportunity to actually encourage, active members within your team to come along and do the same sort of training so that they can support you on your journey as well. Okay, so again, I know I'll come to this, and we do sort of cover these topics bit by bit. But again, this is a sort of staged approach when we start to look at net zero. So now we're talking about the actual process to it. So as I mentioned before, we want to front load emissions reductions. We want to think about our targets, which we'll talk about a bit more detail. We want to be cautious about removals. Again, that's right at the end, and be complementary to wider sustainability. So net zero helps to start the conversations around wider sustainability. Obviously, this is just focused on carbon, but there are opportunities to think about more in terms of your environmental performance. You always want to make sure we're transparent and as much as possible. And we want to have a decarbonisation plan that sits in the back of that as well. Now, when we're looking at target setting, the first thing we need to do for any organization is we need to develop a baseline. So we need a reference year. Now, that doesn't have to be the most recent year. In fact, actually, a lot of organizations are encouraged to maybe go pre-COVID, 2018, 2019, if you have the data available to it. But what we're doing is we're tracking our performance over time. So we want to see, here we are starting at this point, and this is where we need to be at second point. So first and foremost, we want to set our reference year. We want to calculate the carbon emissions associated with that year, and we want to set that as our starting position. Now, again, there are various target frameworks. The Science-Based Target Initiative is one. The way they talk about it is you have a net zero goal and you have an interim. So 2050 is the net zero target and your interim point is 2030. However, I do tend to suggest a staged approach. So what we're looking for more is actually thinking about our performance in 5-year intervals. So 5 years is a good enough time really to think about, well, what can we do in the next 5 years and how can we actually track our performance from year 1 to year 5? And allows you to sort of set longer term benchmarks, because annual performance will go up and down based on business activity. And what we want to see is a general trend of reduction. And that's where 5 years does give you that sort of ability to, to change fairly quickly if it's not quite working the way you want it to do, or as technology improves, that 5-year period allows you to be a bit more dynamic and adaptive to that as well. So set your baseline, think about what net zero means. So I would always recommend set 2050. If you want to be a bit more ambitious, 2040, it's fine. But really what we're talking about in our immediate target setting is to think about the next 5 to 10 years. And that's sort of the key thing. That's our decarbonisation window that we want to drive down our emissions as much as possible. So even if you're not strictly thinking of a net zero commitment, that 5 to 10 year window is ideal. So just to talk about the Science-Based Target Initiative, because it's again a term that we hear a lot of. This is aimed at large organizations primarily. However, SMEs can go through it. What the Science-Based Target basically does is it just gives you a framework and a guidance. So it helps you think about what your targeting should look like over the next sort of 20, 25 years. And it just gives you a linear approach. So it says if you want to hit net zero by 2045, as an example, then these are the emissions you need to reduce on an annual basis to get there. Now, everybody knows nothing in life is linear. A 4% reduction year on year sounds great, but that's not what a decarbonisation plan is going to look like. It might be a 10% this year, a 2% the year after, maybe a bit of maintenance the year after that, and then followed by another 4%. So whilst you'll be able to, on average, hit that sort of reduction, your business activity and what you're able to do in your decarbonisation plan won't be a linear approach. You will have to take into account what you can decarbonize now, what you're going to be able to decarbonize in the future, and how you're going to be able to best approach that as you go forward as well. So it's a useful tool, but that's it. It's just a tool. It gives you a guidance in terms of what to think about in terms of an overarching target to consider. But really what you should think about is what is it that you can do as an organization and how are you going to approach decarbonization, because it needs to be relevant to you at what you're able to do. So that's why I always say science-based targets is great to give you an overview, but you need to think about business activity and what it is you are able to do, because each of us will have different building types. Some might be insulated, some might not be, some might be leased, and therefore insulation is not something you're able to do at the moment, and that would be a landlord requirement. So we'll all have different barriers and limitations to what we can do, so we'll have to focus in other areas. The other side to it really to think about is that electricity is easier to decarbonize. Fossil fuels are harder to decarbonize. So if you're heavily in the fossil fuel element, you just need to aware that those decarbonization plans will actually be a little bit harder than your electricity ones. And on that basis, then we also need to think about which resources contribute to our carbon emissions. And then we want to target those resources individually. So we almost want different plans for different elements. So scope 1 element will have a different plan to our scope 2 element because of the way in which we can decarbonize it, the way in which we can manage the energy better as well. So whilst we might have an overarching sort of goal in terms of where we want to be in our 5-year plans, that needs to be made up of specifics in terms of what can we do in different business elements, what can we do in different fuels, and where are the opportunities for us to decarbonize and what that means as well. So again, these are the sort of details we'll go over in the net zero workshops, but just to sort of give you an idea in terms of when we're starting to think about our targets, how we need to think about the overarching goal, but also then the specifics in terms of how we start to manage our individual resources to get to that overarching endpoint. So in terms of a decarbonisation plan, simply put, it needs to be a clear, systematic approach that responds to climate impacts of your organisation. What we want to do first and foremost is to identify hotspots. Now, we all know that we can't tackle everything at once. We just don't have the time. We have to run our business and still do the day-to-day stuff as well as this on top of it. So what the easiest way to sort of look at it is to calculate your carbon footprint. That gives you the breakdown in terms of your emissions. So where are the different emission sources? Which are the bits that we need to sort of look at? So here's an example of a carbon footprint, and we can see here where the different sources of emissions are. And from that, we can see straight away electricity, natural gas, even LPG and water. They're probably 4 areas that we want to think about in terms of our approach to the decarbonisation. So we want to use this information to identify our hotspots, which are the bits that we really should focus on first and foremost, because they're contributing the most to our carbon footprint, and they're the ones that we want to develop our plans on first and foremost. And then we want to think about the plans. And as I mentioned, this is where we might have a plan for electricity, a plan for gas, and a plan for water in terms of how it operates. Now, this is taken from IEMA. It's an hierarchy introduced by them when we're looking at sort of decarbonising. There's 4 elements we want to think about. I'll ignore the compensation because you've already talked about it. That's the end point. So the first 3 we want to think about is eliminate. Can we actually completely eliminate a source? And by that we mean actually can you look at the business and activity you're doing, and can you actually maybe alter that adaptation or product that you're producing to completely eliminate a GHG emission source? When we're then looking at the next 2, and this is where most organizations will sit, is the reduce and substitute. So first of all, how can we drive efficiencies through our operations? That's energy efficiency, changing technology, etc. And then once we've done the reduction, the substitute, and this is where we start to introduce renewals, electric vehicles over fossil fuel cars, etc. So we want to focus on that reduction part in the first element, because this is where the sort of the quick wins, the low cost opportunities are, and then the substitute is the support of that. So once we've done the reductions, how then can we introduce better, cleaner technology such as solar PV, heat pumps, that kind of thing as well. So we've identified our carbon emissions, we've worked out which areas we want to focus on first, our priorities, and then we start to build our plans, which look at these 3 as the guiding principle. Can we eliminate it? Can we reduce it? And can we substitute it? And how do we plan for that? And at what point do we start to introduce the relevant actions that we need? So as I mentioned, when you're looking at a strategy, and now again, for those who are looking at net zero and really looking at driving that sort of focus through, you want to break your decarbonisation plan into these sort of frameworks. So you've got your short-term actions, which is your first 5 years, your medium-term actions, which is that sort of 5 to 10 year, and then you've got your longer-term net zero actions, which is then 10 years and plus. Now, for most organizations, I would say at this point, if you're just starting out in the net zero, and this is sort of your introduction to this, these are the 2 that you want to focus on. The long-term stuff will come. Really what we want to think about is just decarbonizing ourselves, managing ourselves, and getting ourselves to where we need to be. And that comes in the first 5 to 10 years, really. Yes, we should still look at setting net zero. So, for example, if you have to report under the public procurement policy note, you do have to have a net zero target. But that long-term, what that sort of 10 years looks at the moment is so uncertain. that it's really difficult to start to think about actually what can I include. I'm just going to focus on what I can do here and now, and then as things improve and as information improves, that 10-year window is something that I can actually start to address more and more as I need to, but I can still show what I'm going to be doing in the next 10 years and how I'm going to decarbonize for this sort of first time frame. Again, in terms of short-term planning, we'll discuss more of this within the workshops themselves. But again, anything within the short term, you have your inventory and your target, you start to develop your actions, you break that down into targets and milestones. So what you're doing in year 1, year 3, year 5, etc. Thinking about your specific targets for hotspots areas, so electricity, gas, and thinking about how you drive those individually. And then for scope 3, start to focus on the immediate opportunities. So as I mentioned before, waste, water, that kind of stuff. So if you want to start to include scope 3, those are the really easy ones to go at. The longer term scope 3, the procurement ones, that will take time, and there's a lot of work going around in the background that will hopefully look to develop that further. But for SMEs, you're not actually required to target your scope 3, only scope 1 and 2, but should start to look at how you can start to reduce your scope 3. In terms of the medium plan, we then need to start to think about, well, what does after 5 years look like for me? Do we need to start to think about innovation? Are there ways which we can do our business activity a bit, from a low carbon perspective? You always need to evaluate your progress in relation to any new context. So are there new technologies coming out? Is there regulatory changes that actually change our conversation? And that's why the 5-year one works well, because at that 5-year point, you can look ahead to what does the horizon look like? What sort of changes do I need to be aware of? Making sure that we are readjusting, setting more aggressive targets, always looking to drive down our emissions as much as possible. And like I said, and the last sort of element to it is the removals. Depending on what sort of net zero target you set for yourselves will depend on where that fits in terms of your planning. As I said, we do need to consider what an uncertain future looks like. These slides will become available for you, so this is something you want to read through and go in a bit more time, then that's absolutely fine. The two key things I just want to pick up on this is research and development and partnerships and collaboration. So again, technology, particularly where you're in a heavy carbon industry and you're reliant heavily on fossil fuels, new technologies on the horizon, but not here yet. So there is an element to your organization where you need to think about how are we going to keep abreast of new technology and who's going to be responsible for that. So almost building in that resource to keep aware of things that are up and coming. And that's where the second part comes in really well, partnerships and collaboration. So obviously, like what Business Linkage is doing and what a lot of programs are doing is really sort of helping you provide you with opportunities to get involved with customers, with partnership organizations, to help actually keep you informed of stuff that's up and coming, so that as part of your planning, you can rely on them to help essentially inform you of what things you need to be aware of as well. So when we start to talk about that long-term element to it, these are two really key things that we just need to make sure that we always keep on our radar and keep aware of, because that will help us to drive through the changes that we need. Very quickly, I just want to touch on this because there's a question I get a lot of with organizations is green tariffs, and the fact that as an organization, I can buy a green tariff and now claim net zero, zero emissions. And I just want to say, be very careful with this because the language isn't quite what it seems to be. Essentially, a REGO, or a renewable energy guarantee of origin. So when you buy a green tariff, you're effectively buying essentially a certificate that goes with that energy to say it's come from a green source. Now, not all organizations actually invest in zero carbon generation. Some actually buy REGOs from other organizations and apply it to their energy that's actually come from a coal or a natural gas powered plant. So REGOs aren't even themselves created equally. Most importantly, in UK guidance, the way it works is only one person can hold the REGO. So unless you as an organization have purchased the certificate and you have the actual certificate that says you own the REGO, then you can claim zero emissions. If you're just buying a green tariff, the supplier holds the REGO because they will claim zero emissions, and you still have to report the emissions associated with the grid. But what we do with this is we dual report. And again, we'll talk about more of this in the workshop, but essentially we report both the grid-based factors as well as the zero emissions that we've bought from the market-based factor. So we'd actually have to report both. You can't just claim zero emissions because you've bought a green tariff. So please be very careful with that. If you are buying a green tariff, it's the right thing to do because it helps to encourage the market, invest in more renewables, but it doesn't mean you're zero. The only way to be fully zero is if you have on-site generation. So if you have solar PV yourself, you can then claim that as zero emissions. Last element just to sort of go over then is reporting. So one key thing in terms of reporting is to think about when we're looking at net zero and we're thinking about what it is that we want to achieve to it, we want to make sure that we're using reporting to our benefit. Now, there's two ways we can do it. Internal reporting, great way of engaging with your stakeholders, whether that's staff, board members, SMT, etc. So by keeping them informed of what the ambition is and where you are, helps to keep them motivated and on board. But then also you want to think about external reporting. So if you are potentially interested in looking at, working with different clients or, engaging with wider stakeholders, and actually having that information externally available, so you can demonstrate and show, what everyone, what you're doing and how you're working towards achieving your net zero plans. It just helps to get that communication out there, and it's a great marketing tool for you as an organization. When reporting, think about what your plan is. Track it from your baseline. Also think about annual performance as well. Also think about how well you're doing towards achieving your sort of targets and milestones. So what does that narrative look like, and how can you show the different things? Whenever we're reporting, we can also think about absolute reductions. So actually, year one versus year two, and the exact difference between them. But we also need to take into account that business activity changes. And so it might be actually that you've grown from year one to year two. So actually, the increase has gone up. Now, what we want to do then is to normalize our performance against business activity. So actually reporting against product produced or service delivered or something like that helps to demonstrate that whilst the absolute's gone up, we've actually demonstrated that per customer, our carbon emissions have come down. So you can use that ability of normalization to show that business activity and how you're decarbonizing your business activity rather than just the absolute. As always, your reports want to be honest and simple. Don't make them too jargony. Really you want to try and get people engaged. And I always recommend to organizations to think about a full report, which has everything in it, and then maybe a summary report, particularly for employees. You just want headline figures. Don't necessarily need to know the nuts and bolts to anything, but just recognize where we are, what's going on, that kind of thing as well. So really useful tool to keeping people engaged, and also to really market and shout about the thing you're doing. I mean, you're putting all this work into it, you might as well actually shout about it. And reporting is a great way of sort of doing that. And then again, just sort of touching on that point of reporting, is to think about communicating. So I'm sure we've all heard the term greenwash, and there's lots and lots of conversations going on about the moment about greenwashing and the sort of so the risks that come along with it. We'll talk about greenwashing in the supply chain one, and in the we're doing the decarbonisation one as well. But just sort of touch on it whenever we're communicating net zero, obviously to be truthful and accurate, be really clear exactly what it is you're looking to do and how you're going to get there. Don't hide any important information, really be open and honest about it. Make fair and meaningful comparisons. So, we talked about that sort of business metric. Make sure it's a fair metric and actually relates specifically to your emissions. Depending on the organization that you are, you might want to consider the life cycle of the product, but most importantly, be substantiated. So anything you claim, you've got the information behind you to back that claim up. Okay, so just the last bit then is just around more information and support. So obviously we're running a whole series of workshops, as I mentioned at the beginning of this. So please book on to our workshops if you'd like to go into this in any more detail. The Net Zero workshop is the half day. We're doing net zero in the morning and decarbonisation in the afternoon, because the two work sort of hand in hand. You can either come to one or stay there for the day. The schedule will be in the slide at the end, which you'll have a copy of at the end of today. If you're looking for actually on-site support and would like to speak to our special advisor, Tony Newell, who's our low carbon specialist, he'll be able to actually come to site and have bigger conversations and support you. So if you know what you need to do as part of net zero through what we do in the workshops, we're giving you the theory and how to. He'll be able to actually give you the support on applying it to your organization on the ground as well. So please contact us and contact Tony if you'd like to have that sort of on the ground support as well. Finally, just a couple of things. So as part of Business Lincolnshire, there is the Links Zeller programs that are available. These are essentially website platform that you can go onto, where you can actually start to track your performance, put in your information in terms of your resources, and actually start to track your carbon emissions. It helps you develop action plans. It helps to measure the performance and actions that you're making from any of the actions that you complete. And it's a really sort of user-friendly way to start the journey in terms of looking at what you're doing, what opportunities there are, and actually when you start to introduce those opportunities, what savings you're making. And then also, as I said, as PECT, we run a program called Investors in the Environment. Essentially, it's an environmental management system, and really helps organizations to look at that resources, look look at how you're managing yourself as an organization and start to put in place action plans and targets to make the reduction. So supporting the journey towards net zero through the actual on the ground development and setup of targets and actions, and staff engagement within that as well.